Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to talk about immersion for change with many cool people. We have the first one would be Nathan, I guess. You have to follow the order, Nathan. So Nathan used to work for Discovery VR. He built Discovery VR. He will tell us about that. Then Kevin. Kevin is working for Emblematic Group. And then Christine, who also bring VR to the United Nations. Such an entrance, guys. Great. So we are going to talk about immersion for change, and what does it mean to use VR to influence people and to try to bring VR into the and to help people to understand a specific issue. I guess you guys can start by introducing how immersion for change, how does it relate to what you do, and why somehow have you been chosen to come here?
Sure. Thanks, Hugo, for having me. I can start, if that's okay. I know maybe I wasn't supposed to. So Nathan Brown, I started a company called Tomorrow Never Knows, which is a VR, AR, XR studio based out of San Francisco. My background, prior to that, I was one of the co-founders of Discovery VR. And prior to that, I ran video and entertainment at Huffington Post and was early sort of in the VR practice there by acquiring a company called Riot. And so, are we introducing ourselves? Is that what we're doing? I lost my train of thought.
Please continue. Please continue.
So talking about VR
okay.
for change or immersion for impact and what that means, I think people talk about VR being an empathy machine, and I think fundamentally it allows you to embody someone else's experience. And when you do that, you can really successfully, I think, tell someone else's story and really see perspective from their eyes. And I think when you can do that, you can really impact change.
Hi, I'm Kevin Ski. I work for Emblematic Group. For us, I guess riding off of what Nathan's describing as immersion for change, we were born out of a frustration with traditional media with regards to being able to actually convey storytelling in a way that was meaningful for us. How our stories came about were in early 2012, our founder Nani de la Peña started taking different assets from the environment and actually starting to build worlds around them and place you inside of the story so that you were walking in someone's shoes in a Syrian refugee camp, or you're on a street in Los Angeles waiting to receive food stamps for food, and you see someone collapse because their blood sugar drops so low. So for us, we are mostly driven by grants and different foundations. So we report to them often and try to give them information that shows how their money gets used. So we have a lot of information, and I have some reports with me on different research and studies that we've done with regards to some of our pieces that I might be able to share today.
I'm Kristen. I've been working with VR at the UN since the very beginning, mostly starting with the kind of production, project management side of things. My background is first and foremost, when I was younger, as a teacher. And then I got into campaigning at the UN on all sorts of different sides, so whether it's advocacy, and which gets into the education side of things, but also political pressure for moving issues forward, fundraising, whatever you can possibly imagine that you might want to do in terms of campaigning. And so working on the VR project was mostly focused first on storytelling. So then how do we use story to inspire change in people so that they either find these big global development issues relatable and then can then connect with the people inside of the stories, step into the world, and then feel some sort of individual responsibility to connect into that issue that seems so far away from them. So from a storytelling perspective, that can be one side of things, but of course there's also just the XR field in general, and that's something we're really only starting to get into. So whether it's using it for training or for collaboration, it's still a little bit far, I think, in the future for us from the UN perspective, but definitely something that's going to unlock so much.
just to be sure that we understand really well what does it mean, VR for change, maybe we could give an example of one project that you guys have done where, you know, I'm working in advertising, which is VR for change, but for another change. and so I guess you guys have seen many times, it happened, we do a wonderful film, and people are watching this film in VR, and they remove the headset, and you see that they are crying. Even in advertising, we can do that. And maybe you have one example of one film that you've done where you have seen this, you know, where it actually worked, and people were like, oh, okay, for this project, for this film, yes, people changed their mind because of my work. Do you think you have an idea? You can show some?
I can point to a few. I think there's one here that one of our projects, The Day the World Changed, we did in partnership with the recipient of this year's Nobel Peace Prize, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. And they use this real powerful piece of storytelling to impact change and actually impact policy, and fundamentally to try and make the world a safer place. It has a real powerful effect on people. Another quick project I'll mention is my partner Gabo Aurora had a project last year called The Last Goodbye, which takes a Holocaust survivor back to his camp in Poland, and you see a first person. It's done with photogrammetry, so you feel a real sense of presence, and you get a first person account of what it was like to be in the camp. And it's absolutely incredible, incredibly emotional, and incredibly impactful.
One piece that comes to mind just immediately is 2 years ago at Sundance, we launched a project with Planned Parenthood, which is an organization, a nonprofit organization in America, which provides access to women's health. In America, it's controversial mostly because it provides abortion and other services like pap smears and services that are really like crucial to a lot of different populations inside of America that don't have hospitals. So the experience is a live game engine experience where different protesters are yelling real audio bits from protests that happen at these women's health centers that are trying to prevent and discourage women from entering. So you hear words like, you know, your mother should have aborted you, you should have closed your legs, and it's all real audio. And when you're walking through trying to enter the health center, these protesters are actually making eye contact with you because it's a dynamic game engine experience. So it's not like you can ignore them, they're actually, you know, like looking at you directly. So with this piece, Planned Parenthood actually contracted different research groups to do some studies based on this. And they found that people who had moderate to conservative views going in left the experience afterwards saying that they would support legislation that would prevent protesters from actually being at these health centers. So that's one example of how it kind of changed people's hearts in terms of what our goal was with this experience.
Please continue, yeah.
Well, I guess I'll talk about the most obvious one, which is Clouds Over Sidra. How many people have seen that? Okay, which ironically was made by Gabo when he was working with us. So to give an idea of why the UN got into VR, essentially we were supporting a group of high-level individuals to showcase the Sustainable Development Goals and the need to focus on the most vulnerable people right before the refugee crisis had really exploded into Europe. So we wanted to get some attention at a very hectic, kind of noisy conference, the World Economic Forum. So they released Clouds Over Sidra. They put headsets on 300 of the world's, you know, top leaders and have all these great pictures of that happening. But after that, we said, well, what else can we do with this? So the next big kind of conference we focused on was a high-level donor meeting for the Syrian refugee crisis. And right before that, we showed it to some of the top VIPs who were attending, including the Secretary General of the UN. And they were so moved by it that he actually incorporated her story into his speech and gave it as an example of all the young children that he has seen and invited everybody to go see it. And then they ended up raising over $3 billion at that event, which they had original commitments of $2 billion, so it was more than they had expected. From there, we took it to schools. We have an example of a university which was tasked with writing an editorial about why, if they think that the US should accept more Syrian refugees. And they saw the film, and then afterwards, several of the students said, I'd really like to change my opinion on this. And they went back and they said, from no to yes. And then UNICEF has used it to experiment with face-to-face fundraising, finding that on all different variables, it's getting the attention of more people so that the brand is now in front of more people. So it's kind of can go into so many different areas. We showed it to other refugees, including an Iraqi refugee. He said, oh, I haven't been home in 13 years, and this is exactly what it looks like. It makes me feel so amazing. And I guess that's like the other thing that's so great about VR is it's such an individual collective experience. So every single person can have their own individual reaction, depending on how it applies to their life. So we had another refugee watch it for the first time from a different country, and she started crying and said, I remember the camps we were in. And then another person say like, oh yeah, you know, that looks really great. It looks much better than what I had, you know, they're doing really good. And we had adults cry thinking about their children, and we had young children like applauding, being like, look at this girl, she's my hero, like she can do anything. So it's something that can be universally, if it's done well with storytelling, can be like universally applicable to kind of thinking about these greater issues, but very, very individual.
Christine, it would be good to explain a bit more what is the Sustainable Development Goal and how the United Nations really integrated entirely VR into their communication to try to promote these ideas. You know, you build that, it's quite interesting. It's the first real big institution having a VR department, you know. So how does it work?
Who knows what the Sustainable Development Goals are? Okay.
One guy.
Okay,
the
good.
Brazilian guy.
Two people, yeah. So a little bit of global development backgrounds. What's that? In the year 2000, for the first time ever, a couple of people got together and they wrote a kind of manifesto called the Millennium Agenda with a set of 8 goals to try and drive progress. And it was really focused on quantitative, like how many children can we get into school? How many people can we get on HIV treatment? And really focused on taking financing from the north, injecting it into the global south, and really just trying to reach some of those goals, not very transparent. So they ended up making that a 15-year agenda, and going into 2016, they wanted to make a new agenda that was more inclusive, transparent, and really more bold. So the campaign, which is the parent of the UN Virtual Reality Project, which is the Sustainable Development Goals Action Campaign, we did a whole outreach exercise to teach people about the goals, but also to get their opinions. And so that was through surveys, it was through human interest, photo narrative stories. And then VR became a tool in that kind of arsenal of trying to get people to understand this kind of new global agenda. And some of the really big differences is that it's now focusing on quality instead of quantity. So not how many kids are in school, but do they have pencils? Do the teachers actually know how to teach these classes? Are they being tested? It's also looking at responsibility of every country. So the country of Norway is just as accountable as the country of Burkina Faso, for example. And everything's connected, so if you're polluting in one country, it's going into another country in an ocean gyre or whatever it is. But I'll say that VR has ridden this really interesting new wave in communications that the Sustainable Development Goals is also coming in, which is the ability of social media and other new media to actually have people participating by sharing their own stories. And so we're looking at we actually just launched a new project with Digital Promise Global out of California in the US, and Oculus is funding the first pilot to actually teach young people in high schools or in different locations how to make their own 360 videos for the Sustainable Development Goals, so that they're understanding the language and now can have a very interesting conversation with an adult and leveling the playing fields, but still able to document their real world and, you know, have it applicable to like a global scale. So this kind of shift from just like, you know, global and local moving up and down in different ways.
Is it something that we could see in China?
Yeah. Yeah, so essentially it's pilot testing in Germany right now. It already kind of was existing in a different forum in the US, but it's now going to be like focused first on Germany, but it's an open platform. And I really think that like what's going to make it really interesting is having a lot of different countries involved. And essentially it's a mentorship project. So whether they're part of the program and we provide them with the kits to actually have the tools in the school, or whether they're wealthy enough or can find their own sponsorship to actually access that. And then they just have to follow the basic format of what we're, you know, about the SDGs, or at least describing the artist statement in that way, and focusing on how you make a story that can inspire change and what that change is and call to action. Really cool,
yeah. Maybe Nathan, for you, it would be good also to tell us about Discovery VR. You build this thing. In China, we cannot access this content. So what it is, how does it work? Does it make money? How does it work?
Sure. So Discovery Channel is one of the largest cable channels in the world, and really through their 35-year history, they're all about taking people to places that they couldn't normally go otherwise, and layering a layer of story on top of that. And so a lot of their programming is based around nature and science, and often there's an angle to that which is about sustainability. And so because of that foundation of what the brand was all about, it just made a lot of sense for virtual reality. And luckily, we were there at a time when, unlike a lot of big media companies, our CEO, David Zaslav, we went in and gave him a pitch, and he just said, go. Where a lot of other big media companies would have spent 18 months trying to figure out a strategy. He just said, here's some money, go make stuff. So we just went out and started making things. In 12 months, we made about 250 original pieces of VR all around the world. Some of it I'm proud of and some of it I'm not. But we were experimenting. We were just finding out what worked and what didn't work. And to make that commercially viable, I mean, luckily we were able to gain, because of the volume of content that we were making and because of the brand of Discovery, we were able to scale a pretty big audience for virtual reality. And I think as of last month, I think there's over 7 million downloads of the Discovery VR app, which makes it probably the most prolific VR app in the world. And then in terms of, because we achieved some scale and because we achieved a certain level of quality, we had a lot of advertisers that were interested in working with us. And so we did somewhere in the number of $20 million of original branded VR content that really did a good job of walking that line between a brand and their sort of sponsorship message and just a really powerful, entertaining story. So it's been a tremendous success. It was a pleasure. It was a real absolute joy to build.
Okay, that's cool. Maybe we could share a bit more about how to measure, because you are talking about that, about change. How can we measure? I know that you have also some data, the impact of that. Of course, for this kind of things, it's easier because it's just money. But I guess we want to know a bit more. Okay, how does it? How can we measure these things? Oh, maybe you want to start? Oh,
yeah.
Kevin, you want to start?
Let Kevin, talking
Kevin.
about
Sure.
how do we measure success for change?
Yeah. So the Emblematic has two arms, I would say. Our first arm is advocacy, where we're trying to talk to the other side, right? Where we're trying to find the people who don't agree necessarily with our argument or what we want to what our thesis is. So, for example, like with Across the Line, we're trying to find the people who don't agree with abortion or who think that women should not have access to a pap smear, and trying to show them what it's like on the other side. So our audience is the people who don't agree. And then we have our journalism arm, where we're working with Frontline PBS and we have a series of documentaries that are all volumetric and room scale. And we're trying to make people understand the news in a completely different sense. And so with Frontline, we had these 3 projects that were all funded by the Knight Foundation, and they wanted to know, so what is the impact that you have done with our money, basically? So we had a study with 92 people, a range of ages, and 50% of them had not done VR before, 50% had done VR, and a couple of them actually own headsets. So I think that's kind of a good state of the market spectrum of currently how we should expect consumers to be. And there were 3 experiences that they did. Because our experience was volumetric, we were able to create a 360 render of it, as well as put it up on YouTube. So the piece that we were showing was one about solitary confinement. And it actually puts you inside of a real solitary cell that was 3D scanned, and then you met a hologram of someone who had come out of solitary. Solitary confinement is a practice used in a couple different countries. Mainly, I think America's the largest democracy that uses it as a practice. And we focused on someone in the state of Maine. And he had spent about 20 years in and out of solitary, combined 20 years. He was 18 when he first came in. And so we were showing people on a flat screen on a computer, just on YouTube, and then also on a Gear VR, like a Samsung Gear VR headset, just 360, and then on room scale HTC Vive, which is the full experience. And the results were quite interesting. People focused on their own perspective when they're in an HTC Vive, and they focused much more on how it felt for myself to be inside there sharing space with him. When you're in 360, they actually focused on the voiceover, what he was saying a little bit more. They were able to remember full statement and phrases better. So the information was conveyed or absorbed a little bit better, whereas people might have been distracted a bit more with the room scale, but they had this visceral sense of presence and embodiment of actually what it's like to be there. With the flat screen, it was very similar to the 360, but everyone said, this was a very interesting point as well, that everyone said HTC Vive was the easiest to use and would recommend it the most. So I think with regards to making impact and sharing VR and spreading it, I think that was an interesting point, that they would actually tell other people to try out VR, but that was the room scale one, not the 360 experience.
Christine, before you reply, I suggest to the audience, I see many documentary people, do not hesitate to bring questions in the middle of the conversation. We are a very small amount of people, so it should be fine. So for you, how do you measure? What's the challenge around that? Of course, it's difficult.
Yeah, I think global development agencies like the UN and NGOs, it's been very difficult to we're also getting caught in this sort of VR fatigue. There was a lot of initial excitement, but a lot of times all of the excitement went to making the film and launching it, and then there was no funding set aside and there was no plan for what to do with it after. So there's no thought about what the call to action was for the person watching it, which is not always necessary. Sometimes it's just an educational piece. But Sherry said yesterday that the most important things in like a neuroscientist way, is the before, the after, and the vulnerability of a person after they've watched some of these stories, which also was said yesterday. We don't want to make them cry, but only a little, and I agree with that. Like if we make people cry, they're going to have a negative kind of association with that story. So we try to tell really empowering stories about people. But how do we start to hack that sort of full continuum of distribution, which also includes, the ability to either act on the spot or to take an action later? How do we make it easier for people to take that action, whether it's through a platform or whether it's at that actual location where we're showing it? And so that's something that I advocate internally and with some of my counterparts, that we have to really start to strategize around a lot more. Especially in the beginning of VR, a lot of it was offline, so we don't actually really know how many people have seen some of our films. And A lot of times the UN isn't accountable to give those numbers. It's not as necessary, but it is definitely a kind of case for support for getting more funding to make more and to continue the programming.
About funding, how do you guys found an impact content? How does it work? Where do you find the money?
Well, it's, inherently it's generally non-commercial, right? So it's a challenge often to find the kinds of funding that it takes to make something of a certain level and scale. We've had a lot of success with foundations. We've had a lot of success with cultural institutions. We've had some success with colleges and universities and their funds. But generally, it takes a lot of creativity to put together a budget at the scale that generally we're looking to raise to make a really prestigious project.
Do you think that, for example, Chinese filmmaker could try to find money in the US to finance a project?
I think absolutely, without a doubt.
Cool.
I just feel like whatever the organization might be, if they have an agenda to tell a certain story and to reach a certain audience, and any filmmaker, regardless of where they are, has the ability, I think, to partner with an organization like that. And so I definitely think this market would be an opportunity.
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to know if you're getting into VR for change or like trying to convince people about a certain thing, know the people who don't agree with you really well, and that will help you a lot. Because that is kind of, that's your goal, is to perhaps to convince them and to change their minds, right? And that actually helps illuminate where you can find the sources of money, or the people who are the nonprofits who work in this field, who are the foundations whose mission is this, right? To convince people or to change or to make progress in those certain fields.
Yeah, from a UN perspective, it's really difficult to get money into the UN and back out of it. It's kind of set up to measure like pencils and pens and not like ideas. So we've gotten really creative in the past, a lot of in-kind contributions or sort of third-party sponsorship. So yeah, it's a very difficult topic.
Is it something where brands, for example, can participate in these kind of things? You have sponsorship, I guess. Is it possible to collaborate like this with the content for the United Nations? Or?
Yeah, and another way we're kind of getting around it is, a lot of what I do is curating exhibitions for political forums. So last year we had a conference on the ocean, and the UN has never made anything about the ocean. So I did this sort of outreach and collected a lot of films that had already been produced and brought them into the UN. And that kind of kicked off a whole new kind of strategy for us as becoming an internal distribution, since we have such a footprint and access to world leaders. So we can become that kind of catalyst to getting these stories to where they need to be heard, and to tell great stories. A quick example, just to kind of drive...
Can I interrupt? Is that like in the form of a festival type environment, like that you curate films around a certain topic, or is it more distributed through an app, or both?
No, it's usually physical. So, like the General Assembly, or like the European Development Days, or maybe a government has just a showcase internally and they want some stories. Being a neutral brand, they can come to us knowing that there's 194 countries that are sort of, making this, something that we have to be accountable to in different ways. So we're not going to be as activisty and offensive to some of them. But we've had some interesting kind of successes getting a story about Palestine in front of the Security Council, for example. So we're able to do some activism internally as well.
Is there a way to also, when you distribute it, could you get some revenue out of the distribution of this kind of content? Yeah, where? How do you do that?
So, for example, the frontline projects that we're working on are going to be distributed through Amazon, which is starting to intake, and look for premium content.
Amazon is looking for content in VR.
Yeah,
okay.
So we weren't necessarily planning on distributing it, but just because it was kind of an experimental project entirely, and but yeah, it seems to have turned a little bit of a dime or two.
Yeah, and just also about brands, I think there are several instances of brands sponsoring content for good. I mean, I know one that comes to mind is Haagen-Dazs did a VR piece about the disappearance of bees. That's really interesting. I don't know if you guys have seen that. There's another one that, when I was at Discovery, we had Toyota sponsor a project about polar bears that we shot in Alaska. And there's lots of other ones to mention. But just like NGOs and nonprofits have an agenda and a message that they want to support with immersive content, so do brands. And so I think that's a real opportunity.
And for you, Christine, you distribute your content outside of this traditional, like the General Assembly or only political instance. Do you do cinema, for example? In China we have a lot of location-based place where you could distribute these kind of things. Is it an idea? What do you think about that?
Yeah, we've had several conversations about that. At some of the arcades, we've given them our content. It's open sourced. I mean, we've been in the process of building our own sort of actual online distribution, but it just hasn't gotten there yet. I think one of the things that we're also really thinking about is like inequalities in different countries and access to technology as well as access to being able to see the stories. So we're keeping in mind, who has a smartphone and doesn't, and are there any headsets in that country? Like, what is the market? How can we help to do that? And I think when we got into VR, and still even today, like a lot of the people that we're showing have never tried it on before, and we're in places that most people aren't thinking of, like in a township in South Africa, for example. And we try to make our technology available that we have internally as much as possible, or to broker some of those partnerships with tech companies and hardware to get those stories out there.
Cool. How you guys? I know it's maybe your first time or second time in China for most of you. I guess you are attracted by this big market. There is things to do here. If you had to say to this audience, how could you collaborate with China? What kind of things are you looking for? What kind of information are you looking for? How do you see things to do here for each of you?
I mean, I think it's across the board, to be honest. I mean, everyone in this business is looking for funding, first and foremost, I think. So where there's funding, interest in funding opportunities, I think if that's in China, that's very interesting. I think, I'm personally always looking for great talent, whether that's from a technical perspective or from a storytelling perspective. And so there's so many great filmmakers and documentary, filmmakers and so on here in China. That's exciting to me. And then distribution. I mean, it's all about, as a filmmaker and a creator, you make something, you want the world to see it. And so this is such a big and powerful market. And I think, getting our stories out in front of as many people as possible is really what it's all about.
So we've actually done 2 projects with a Chinese artist named Lin Yi-Lin. And last year we launched it at Art Basel in Hong Kong. And it's an art piece that's a recreation of his performance art. And so as a performance artist, he was protesting the development of Guangzhou, and he was moving in the 90s a wall of bricks across the highway. And in this art piece, you're actually, like participating and recreating and sharing in his performance art of what he's doing. The second piece that we worked on with him is at the Guggenheim Museum in New York right now. It's on showing, and it's in collaboration with Jeremy Lin, the basketball player, and you are his basketball. And it's a way more abstract, conceptual piece, and he takes you as a basketball, dribbles you, and then dunks you. So those are, I guess, 2 pieces that we've done, and we're really interested in the creative vision of different Chinese artists. So we're looking for more of that, definitely.
Yeah, I think from a storytelling perspective, what we're looking for, being such a global organization, is people telling their own stories. I think we just want to ensure that there are authentic stories about real people or representations of that in different ways. So having something like the My World 360 project here in schools would be great, so that we're getting kind of the ground view of what is happening in people's lives here would be really amazing. Again, I agreed with the distribution. You know, there's such an amazing amount of people here who are capable of doing so much, and we're all connected. And so being able to kind of, you know, work together to tackle some development challenges would just be incredible, whether that's through like, you know, training together or collaborating. I think like there's so much that could come out of here.
Okay. You know, recently many people changed their name of their company, my company included, where my company used to be called Crow's Nest VR, and we changed to Crow's Nest XR. You know, because we are all into AR now also, and interested in mixed reality and what we can do. We know that we have the same skill set to do this type of things. We understand very well what it is. How do you see XR for change? How do you see the use of AR into convincing people? You want Kevin?
I was spacing out a little bit.
Maybe it's the time also to explain what you do with Web VR, and how do you see Web XR also.
Yeah.
All these cool things you are doing.
Okay, so going back to, I guess, AR for change, one thing that we wanted to do with, I guess this is something that we actually did with the Wall Street Journal, was how can we kind of change how we view data visualizations. So we took, with their Dow Jones Innovation team, their API to the stock market index, the Dow Jones Index, live every second it's updated, and we put it in front of you as a 3D visualization. So it's a tree map, and you know, it's like a table in front of you. The size of the plate almost represents the size of this company's market share, and it's the S&P 500 visualized in front of you. So it's just changing completely how you know, when you look at a dinner table, for example, and the places are set, you know how many people are going to come to dinner. It's kind of trying to convey that same instant understanding of how the market did at the end of the day or at the end of the week. And you brought up kind of some of our initiatives that we're working on with Mozilla, which is pushing a lot on open web VR standards. And what we're interested in doing is actually changing how volumetric content's authored. So it's a huge roadblock right now, I think, for the entire industry, that it takes maybe 2 engineers and 3 weeks to put together a room scale experience that has high quality photogrammetry and also a person inside. And you really can't do that in today's market or like ecosystem without having probably at least like 15,000 US or 20,000 maybe. So what we're trying to figure out is a way for news organizations to be able to borrow other people's photogrammetry environments, for example, like the Supreme Court, if you're doing a story there, and place in your own green screen video card. So, for example, you could just interview anyone in your green screen studio and then place them in the Supreme Court by borrowing, the Washington Post photogrammetry scan. Or you could borrow a scan from Arizona Republic that they did of the border, and then place your own interviews that you did with migrants inside of that environment, and then publish to WebVR and A-Frame, and then it's immediately accessible as a room scale environment piece on, on computer browsers, on mobile phones, as a 360 thing. And I'm so sorry for the translators who are trying to keep up with this and all my lingo that I'm using. So please come up to me if you have any things that you want to clarify, because I'm using a lot of different terms. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
We have a question from João.
Hi, good afternoon. I guess that my question is, I'm also work with nonfiction immersive content, and I mean, we all know it's quite sensitive. It can be, delicate issues, and we're telling stories about real people. So I guess what are the strategies that you guys apply to, not marginalize even more the people of the stories that you're telling, and I guess create content still that is faithful, that is responsible, and yeah, I guess like what are the strategies that are possible, you know, and that you guys have applied or you guys foresee that need to be applied,
Yeah.
things for, you know, in this direction?
To who do you want to
To
ask this?
everybody. I want to
Oh
listen.
God.
On the tip of my tongue,
They
there's
love
this
this question.
saying that's like if you're in someone's shoes, then you've stolen their shoes. So I kind of like keep that in mind about like who your audience is and who your subjects are, and making sure that you're like not exploiting your subjects themselves, and being very careful of who you're showing your content to as well, because you know, like whenever a woman goes through like across the line, which is our VR experience about like abortions, we make sure that it's like, you know, that they have all the warnings about the types of things that they're going to be seeing. Or if someone who goes through the solitary confinement piece, we warn them that like if you've been in a prison before, this can be really traumatizing for you. So yeah, it's just some words of caution and advice.
I mean, I would say it's as you know, as a creator, it's about truth and respect. And what I love about VR, and particularly 360 for nonfiction, is that it's harder to fake almost than a flatty documentary. There's less editorial, you know. And one thing I actually encourage filmmakers, and at Discovery we experimented with this quite a bit, which is actually you know, when you're shooting 360, to not hide the equipment that you're using to photograph the subject and to interview the subject, because to me that brings even more truth to what the situation is. And so, you know, I guess to me, I think there's even more opportunity to be less, you know, or to be more respectful to what the subject is.
One of the things that we've had a kind of conversation about, you know, there's 6 official languages in the UN. It's expensive to dub them. Do we use subtitles or do we dub? How should we approach this? I'm more of a fan of actually using subtitles, because it's actually the words of the people, whether it's captured in a voiceover and then applied to like a scene or whatnot. But I find that to be a little bit more authentic. The other thing is, you know, thinking about the whole continuity of the project. The World Bank made a film in Fiji about climate change. They showed it at the UN Climate Conference. Then they went back to Fiji. There were Fijian filmmakers on the team actually making it, but then they went back to Fiji and showed it to the subjects. And they have a whole, you know, mini documentary about that entire process and how those people perceived it. And some of them were like, "Oh wow, I'm famous," and some of them were like, "Oh my gosh, I didn't realize how bad it was until I saw, you know, what we've actually said and seen it with my own eyes." So it's actually, you know, bringing a lot into their kind of consciousness too. So thinking about that as well.
Maybe we can take one more and last question. Someone, of course.
Yes, one question per panel. That's my motto. So you were saying that you are having conversation with China, that you try to taking maybe like content, to putting content there, or to try to find filmmakers to tell you Chinese story. But is there like, do you see lots of difficulties ahead along the road, or you think it's gonna work soon? I don't know, any of you?
Please choose.
Well, I think, to be slightly candid, of course there's sensitivities about, you know, certain subject matter here, and some censorship, and the UN is a trusted brand, and the Sustainable Development Goals is a global agenda that all 194 countries have signed on to. So that's actually a sort of safe spot where people can start to talk about maybe some challenges. Which is why we like this My World 360 project, and I think it could do pretty well here.
Yeah, and I would say there's obviously going to be some sensitivities that need to happen. I think it's really a crawl, walk, run scenario, and I think we're just starting to crawl in terms of how we can partner with one another, and I think that's probably the right strategy.
Yeah, having worked with a Chinese artist, we found it was a completely amazing, great experience, and you know, he had his translator in between, and something about the medium actually helped because the way that you edit and you work together and you collaborate on something with the presence and the type of notes that you're giving, we found it to be a very pleasant experience. I'm trying to figure out exactly how to talk about what it was like to have him go through one of the experiences and then give his notes. But yeah, it was just, we had a good translator and kind of similar things that you would do with traditional media, I guess, if you're gonna work on a project or a film here. Yeah.
Any more question? Yeah. No. I don't think so. Then I think we're good. Yeah? VR for good? Yes. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank
And
you.
Thank you.
Thank you all
see you
very
later.
much.
Bye-bye.